Mr. President, distinguished members, Secretary General, Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, many thanks for your very warm welcome. You've been so kind as to invite me here and to grant me all the latitude that any speaker could wish for. Today we are not bound by a strict parliamentary protocol that would restrict what I might discuss. There's no set topic, there's no predetermined, limited freedom of a negotiation set before the first sentence was uttered. Speaking freely is a tremendous privilege, and for one such as I, given my age and my origins, it is indeed an historic gift. And I wish to use that gift of speaking freely to thank you, members and partners of the Council of Europe, for your work, and I wish to fortify you for politically uncomfortable discussions. I'm concerned by this. How can we help this precious but sadly often underestimated institution to emerge from the shadow of the European Union and be appreciated for its true worth? And after those thanks, I wish to explain that I've come as a friend and advocate for the Council of Europe. I believe that the Council and its Parliamentary Assembly deserve greater attention, greater support in order to discharge your remit to the full. I stand here as your ally. My visit to Strasbourg, of course, has an overarching theme, human rights. And that is why I wish to address one of my chief concerns right at the outset. We continue to need the Council of Europe. Indeed, this is more than ever the case, as a critical forum for human rights. I stand before you because human trafficking and forced prostitution must stop, because members of opposition groups should not have to fear persecution or even fear for their lives, because people should not face discrimination, whatever the reason. And may I begin by thanking you for your achievements. I speak as the President of Germany to this body, the oldest political organization of Europe, which came into being as a reaction to two dreadful wars that claimed the lives of millions of people and split the continent for almost half a century. In Article 1 of the Statute of the Council of Europe, we read, "The aim of the Council of Europe is to achieve a greater unity between its members." Ladies and gentlemen, you may imagine this, or you know for yourselves, that in 1949 that was tremendously significant. There was a tremendous longing for peace. There was a courage that it took to work together and cooperate politically. And the idea was difficult to get across then, bringing together the peoples of Europe more closely in economic, social and cultural terms. The Council of Europe then embodied the vision of a political Europe way before the European Union developed into a formal political community through economic interdependence and the adoption of a common currency. The Council of Europe has always been in development and was held a particularly strong attraction at the end of the Cold War. And many people remember that with deep gratitude, including myself. Here in this very chamber, in the summer of 1989, Mikhail Gorbachev was a special guest, and he spoke at the lectern, setting out his idea of a common European house as an aspiration for the whole continent. This was 3 months before Hungary opened its borders and 4 months before the fall of the Berlin Wall. History has indeed recognized that Gorbachev was right on this point. Now, ideological opponents became partners. Over a good 10 years, with two exceptions, all the former communist states of Europe joined this organization. Human rights, democracy and rule of law, therefore, are a paradigm for Central and Eastern European states as well. Today, there are over 800 million citizens from 47 countries represented in the Council of Europe. There can be no doubt that the Council of Europe is the largest house that we have ever built on this continent. It is distinguished from all other European institutions by virtue of this pan-European character. The Council of Europe expands our view to the whole continent and is the guardian of our values and founding principles far beyond the borders of the EU. Therefore, it is indeed an honour to be with you today. 47 states, as I said. That is a large and indeed multifarious group. The Council of Europe constitutes a community from the Atlantic to the Pacific, from the Northern Cape to the Bosphorus. However, it is perceived differently from different points of the compass and used in differing ways and often valued in differing fashions as well. The Western European public usually discusses European issues in relation to the institutions of the European Union and very rarely discusses the Council of Europe. In the east of our continent and in the Mediterranean area, the Council of Europe has and still enjoys a much stronger significance. I remember it very well. During communist times, in addition to the United Nations, the Council of Europe was an important beacon for human rights activists and opposition groups. Later, it afforded support in building the new national democracies of Central, East and Southeast Europe. It is easy for me to act as an advocate for an institution with this history and with this political and ethical basis. But in addition to that, I also put my shoulder to the wheel and fought alongside you. Before I look to the future, may I emphasize it's important as to how we understand our own identity and how we build that going forward. And it links, to me, the expectations I have of the Council of Europe. Rights and freedoms on paper do not suffice. They must be guaranteed in practice. Accession to the Council of Europe has always been voluntary. However, the commitment made at the moment of accession must be lasting and reliable. Council of Europe members commit themselves to the values of the Council of Europe and the legal standards of the Council of Europe. In addition to the European Convention on Human Rights, we have a further 211 conventions, an impressive number. Member states are pledged to transpose these conventions into their national legal order as swiftly as possible. National bodies may not undermine this shared canon of values. This applies in particular to the guarantees offered by the European Human Rights Convention. In my view, the credibility of the European Human Rights Convention relies on us viewing it and dealing with it in practice as a shared asset. I myself recently signed legislation which became necessary because the Court of Human Rights had found Germany to be in breach of human rights standards. And it was necessary to guarantee that national law and the actions of public bodies were human rights compliant. all 47 member states have to draw the relevant consequences from decisions of the European Human Rights Court. I emphasize these perhaps obvious points because prior to 1989, my experience living in the East was of a state that did not consider itself bound by its own law or by international conventions. This was an era when the letter of the law and reality bore no relation one to another. Hence, I am particularly attached and to the value of the fact that we now enjoy a Europe where, in addition to a national legal area, there is a European area. This reduces the danger of abuses of fundamental rights going unrecognised or being dismissed. And we are able to address that which is of concern to us. I myself was particularly concerned last year when the Committee on the Prevention of Torture of the Council of Europe reported ill treatment in European prisons. And I'm concerned time and again when agreed standards remain a dead letter or are consigned to the bin because arbitrary behaviour, corruption and cover-up prove stronger than the courageous Council of Europe or NGO voices of admonishment. Human rights, democracy and rule of law. We need to insist tirelessly on those values, otherwise we will lose credibility and will be reduced to an empty husk. We need to engage in regular self-affirmation in each country, and we should not be prevented from so doing by a government. It is a good thing that the Council of Europe's monitoring reports are consulted and cited, and also that the work of the Venice Commission attracts so much interest. This helps all of those who stand up for the implementation of democracy, rule of law and human rights. I know that the Council of Europe, like many other institutions, is under pressure to make savings. Allow me to make a minimum demand. We should never seek to make savings at the expense of offering practical help to ensure respect for human rights.
And that brings me on to my second point. Politics is always about human rights policies. Fortunately, the Cold War is now behind us. And yet, we are astonished and we are afraid when we see that there is still a continuation of an old conflict, albeit in nuanced form. Already back in the 1970s and in the 1980s, Germany and other Western European countries found it rather hard to speak out openly about human rights violations in the eastern part of Europe. Indeed, at the time, they were afraid that by speaking out they would be jeopardizing the policy of change through rapprochement. Now, in the meantime, of course, we all witnessed this, the communist regimes had to yield. States of Western Europe, Central Europe and Eastern Europe now all abide by the same consensus of democratic values. Having said that, when it comes to dealing with human rights breaches, there's still a fair amount of controversy. There was in the past and there still is today. And some will argue, as they did back then, still today, that defending human rights could actually in some way contradict a successful implementation of our political interests and our economic interests. Well, let me just say one thing in response to that. The argument according to which good economic cooperation would necessitate compromises when it comes to human rights issues, well, that argument is even less convincing today as it was back then. After all, somebody will decide to invest if that person feels that there is certainty in terms of planning, if there is a stable legal framework. Reliability is an absolutely crucial factor when it comes to business around the world. We are operating at a time of globalization. Individual states are more and more dependent on one another. And if you look at the current developments here on the continent of Europe in terms of economic relations, then you'll find that being critical and having a critical discourse about human rights does in no way constitute an obstacle to an increase in trade. Most importantly, it should be remembered that the member states of the Council of Europe have agreed to a clear framework of cooperation. And what this means in practice, and here I would employ perhaps the jargon used by businessmen, what this means is that human rights are simply non-negotiable. We would like to make sure that all those who wish to enforce rights that have been anchored on paper, those who wish to enforce them in whatever country they may be, they should not be abandoned. We cannot abandon them. For my generation, back then, the key word was Helsinki. That was what saved us. For many civil rights activists today, particularly in those societies that are undergoing transformation, the key word is the European Convention on Human Rights. If a member state of the Council of Europe violates its rules, bearing in mind that that member state signed up to those rules when it joined the organisation, well, such an event cannot go unmentioned, nor can it go unsanctioned, unpunished. And therefore, in both senses of the words, we need to feel that we are entitled to intervene. Indeed, it is our duty to intervene. We have an obligation to intervene as Europeans on the basis of the European Convention on Human Rights. We also have an obligation as citizens of the world on the basis of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Human rights are universal and indivisible, and responsibility for human rights is also universal and indivisible. In February of this year, I attended the session of the Human Rights Council of the United Nations in Geneva. I was there as a guest, and I met with delegates from all over the world. I can tell you that that audience represents an incredible diversity in terms of backgrounds, in terms of experience. And faced with this audience, I was once again made aware of the fact that our human rights achievements after the Second World War really was an immense civilizing feat. At that time, we were gazing into the deepest human abyss, and this situation forced us to open our eyes to what is actually essential. The international community of all those who have signed up to human rights, that international community was not born primarily out of ideological battles. I would say that it was born out of existential crises, because we realized if human beings lose their rights, it actually means that at the end of the day, we've lost everything. We have lost mutual respect. We will have lost dignity. We will have lost our lives, and we will have lost our future. And therefore, I sincerely hope that human rights in all parts of the world will become I know that many will say that they constitute Western values, but I hope that in the Western world as well, we will now look upon human rights as a catalogue of rights. That would mean that human rights would find its sources in all parts of the world, on all continents, and its imperatives would prevail worldwide. I think that, after all, human rights are our most important global common good. Human rights are innate and they are inalienable. Human rights apply to everyone. Human rights are premised upon an irrefutable fact, namely that all human beings, because of the fact that they are human beings, are all equal, whatever cultural, religious, social or other differences we may have. And therefore those who strengthen human rights will strengthen humanity as a whole. Ladies and gentlemen, that brings me on to my third point. The fact that implementing human rights is a standing item on our agenda. It's an ongoing task. I'm, of course, aware of the fact that these matters have political consequences and that societal change requires time, particularly in those countries that are undergoing a transformation. After all, these countries have a completely different political and historical background compared to other countries who have had democracies here in Europe for decades, if not for centuries. That being said, sometimes the time factor can provide us all with quite a surprise. Look at what happened at the heart of Europe. Look how rapidly change took place. It was quicker and indeed more successful than some of us may have thought to begin with. By way of an example, talking to the Polish president, Bronisław Komorowski, talking about our expectations, maybe, if not 50 years ago, then 25 years ago. What were our expectations vis-à-vis Europe? And what has actually happened in reality in the meantime? Well, if we compare the two, then I think we have every reason to believe in the creative power of our European societies, more so than some politicians are wont to do. Now, of course, it must also be made clear that in Europe we cannot have double standards when it comes to human rights. You can't have a two-tier system when it comes to human rights, and you can't have any differentiation in treatment between one member state and another. The Council of Europe examines the issue of human rights, democracy and the rule of law. It does so in the East, in the West, and it applies the same standards. The Council of Europe will of course take into account the complexities of each situation, but nevertheless it will uphold the same standards for all. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for that work. One of the many tasks that we are confronted with at the moment, which is of great interest to us, is the whole issue of fighting against racism and intolerance. And indeed, the Council of Europe set up its very own committee to deal with racism and intolerance. That committee was born in 1993. At the time, even in my own country, in Germany, there were unfortunately horrifically some racist riots and clashes. Even in my own hometown, Rostock, I was shocked to experience these phenomena. And a little later in time, there was a series of murders carried out by an extreme right-wing association. The solving of those crimes is still something that keeps us on tenterhooks back in Germany. At this moment in time, throughout Europe as a whole, we're experiencing discrimination and violence in many forms, in many manifestations. You have, for instance, majorities who discriminate against minorities, or you have indeed other scenarios where you might have minorities who are discriminating against majorities, or indeed against other minorities. There is a particularly relevant issue in this context, namely the exclusion of Sinti and Roma people. I would very much like to welcome the fact that the Council of Europe has used this particular example as a topic for a PR campaign and a PR slogan which speaks out against all forms of discrimination. The campaign is entitled Dosta, which means enough. I think we need more of these campaigns. We need to roll out more. In Germany, at this moment in time, we've got a big poster campaign underway. There's, for instance, a picture with a very famous actress, and the text says, "If you've got something against Muslims, I'm a Muslim." And then there's another poster with a prominent politician who says, "If you've got something against gay people, I am gay." Now, I don't know whether these kinds of activities could be rolled out in future in all member states of the Council of Europe. Perhaps we could have a coordinated campaign. I think that this would be a very positive common learning process leading us to the same goal. Learning curves will have an impact on all of our personal experiences and also, of course, on the development of our societies as a whole. I must say, I was filled with optimism, and I continue to be filled with optimism when I see the young generations in Central and Eastern Europe. They are growing up with a new self-image, a new identity, and they have turned this into a motivation for political claims. Some young human rights activists are actually in the public gallery today, the visitors' gallery, and they know what they want, and they also know who it is that can come to their help in achieving what they want. As committed citizens, the Council of Europe is there to help them, and they know it. Civil society does need a dependable reference point, a contact point, if you like, somewhere where people can find a hearing, where they can lodge their complaints, and where they can seek assistance and support. And when it comes to the interests of civil society, of course, we should not remember two countries in particular when talking about the defence of these civil rights, because these two countries are on a continent, but they're not yet members of the Council of Europe. What I would wish for, what I would hope, is for the domestic political situation in Belarus to change to such an extent that we can start seriously talking about the accession of Belarus. That could be motivated, for instance, if the death penalty were to be abolished, if political prisoners were to be released from detention, and indeed if democratic reforms could take place in that country. That would be such a wonderful situation. Then you have Kosovo. There the political situation is somewhat different. I think it's very positive that Kosovo and Serbia have recently reached an agreement which is of historic and unprecedented nature. We know, of course, that the Parliamentary Assembly has been very active here. You've worked on this issue, particularly since the beginning of this year. And we know, of course, from your work as well, that more of an effort needs to be made by Kosovo when it comes to fighting corruption, fighting organised crime. We know that that remains to be done. But in terms of the future development of that country, I think that integration into the international community really provides an important impetus for the country. And that's why I would very much like for all member states of the Council of Europe to recognise Kosovo as a state. People in Kosovo, people in Belarus, they too have the right to take part in our canon of values, in our community of values within the Council of Europe. They are entitled to the protection of their human rights, which should prevail throughout the whole of Europe, and they should be entitled to lodge complaints before the European Court of Human Rights. The European Court of Human Rights is often the last hope for those who are desperate and dispossessed, those who have been deprived of their rights, those whose human rights have been violated. The number of cases pending before the European Court of Human Rights is constantly on the increase. We need to make sure that the European Court on Human Rights can be reformed in order to make sure that it does not become a victim of its own success because of the sheer volume of cases, because of its enormous caseload. The court needs to be functional, and it needs to be there in order to save those who protest against human rights violations and who risk so much, sometimes even their lives. One of them is in the audience today. Dear champions of human rights, ladies and gentlemen, honourable representatives of European non-governmental organisations, I turn to you because I would like to take this opportunity to speak of my greatest respect for you. I know that I shall be meeting with some of you personally a little bit later, but I would like to address myself to all of you who are here and all those who would like to be here. I would like to thank you, because without your courage, some of the promises made by the Council of Europe would only be promises on paper. I think we can safely say that, yes. And without your vehement, loud and clear voices, democracy would not survive. And indeed, without your solidarity, which you show in such practical terms, and which you will continue to show in the future, without that, our demands for universal and indivisible human rights would remain just demands. They would not be a tangible reality for every human being here. And therefore, ladies and gentlemen, I call upon you to defend humanity, and I call upon you to make the Council of Europe the best possible organisation it can be. Internally, it needs to be a strong community within Europe, and despite all differences, it needs to both generate and strengthen cohesion within its ranks. And vis-à-vis the outside world, we should be a convincing example of living democracy, of the binding rule of law, and of universal human rights. Thank you.